Hi, everybody. Welcome here to the Wine with Jimmy channel. I'm your host, Jimmy Smith. Thank you for stopping by. Welcome to this exciting starting series on California. And we are beginning with an introduction to California, going through the likes of its history, climate, topography, key grape varieties, vineyard management, and so on. Really wonderful. Now, if you are very interested in taking accredited courses around California, do look out for our capstone California courses, which are available through my wine school, westlondonwineschool.com. And if you have any questions, maybe you have some experience with California or Californian wine, then please do get in touch by commenting on this video below. So in this series one of California, we are looking at really just the introduction to give you the infrastructure of California in terms of wine. Now, part 1 and part 4, which actually is on the key grape varieties, is looking at those specific subjects, so history and grape varieties. All other parts, that's 2, 3, 5, and 6, are available only on my e-learning portal. That's over at winewithjimmy.com. So please make sure, of course, that you visit there to gain extra access with all of the extra resources available. Okay, let's begin with looking at California, just so you understand where it is located within the United States of America. We are found here on the western seaboard. It's sitting really below Oregon, as you can see on this middle western point. It's a rather large state, and we call it the Golden State. Multiple reasons why that is the case. Firstly, gold was found here, starting a gold rush in the middle of the 19th century. Also, you have fields of golden yellow poppies, which cover the entire state in spring. And that beautiful flower is the official flower of the state and has been for over 100 years. Furthermore, think about the famous landmark, the Golden Gate Bridge, which was built back in the 1930s, which is iconic not only for San Francisco, but also California as well. So just a few reasons why we call it the Golden State. A few facts for you in terms of the state and viticulture and winemaking. So you'll see as of 2019, we have 257,000 hectares under vine. And if you go back to 1990, it was less than half of that number. So huge expansion and growth in terms of vineyards in the last 30 years. We have 147 AVAs, that's American viticultural areas. So things like Sonoma County, Russian River, things like Napa, and all the nestled ones as well. So you've got a rather complex mosaic in terms of geography for all of the mapping of these key areas. We have over, well, nearly 6,000 grape growers. We have something like 4,500 wineries, which is quite crazy. It is America's #1 producer. It occupies just 4.3% of the land mass of the United States of America, but produces in excess of 80% of the country's wine. That's 2.3 billion liters of wine annually. That's around 250 million cases. And Californian wine sales reached $43.6 billion in the US market in 2019. Some rather quite impressive figures for you to think about there. But let's get into the major focus of this individual video, looking at the history of California. Now, it's not as detailed and as long as, say, places in Europe, but nonetheless, there is an interesting amount of history, certainly shaping California in terms of wine in the last 200 years or so. So we're going to go through that. You see, actually, over 250 years ago, we could say that it begins. So in the middle of the 18th century, we have the importance of Father Junipero Serra, who, of course, was a very important person in terms of the church, with a lot of history dating back to places like Majorca, and decides to come as a missionary across to the New World, and comes out to sort of New Mexico area to begin with, and moves north. Very important because is kind of considered as the father of fathers in terms of the influence in this area, landing in the middle of the 18th century. Now, this kind of starts a mass of, sorry for the pun, but a mass of missionaries being established, and there are fort missionaries. So 26 forts and missionaries are built along the Californian coast from San Diego to Sonoma, so quite an extensive area from 1769 to 1826. So you've got this expansion moving north of these important missionaries at the time. Now, grapes were integral to these missionaries. Why? Well, we're going to talk about that on the next slide, but really, for now, it's for sacramental purposes. Wine was needed for sacramental liturgical purposes, and of course for some commerce as well. And this is what we'll talk about going through the next few slides. So the oldest Californian winery was established at the Mission San Gabriel, which you see here, been reconstructed since, and the El Camino Real is established, which is a road connecting all of the missions and forts between San Diego and Sonoma, as we previously mentioned. So it's quite an important infrastructure network connecting these important new locations within the West Coast. And in terms of this, I just want to map the beginnings for you so you understand where this starts. So here actually is a picture of Los Angeles. You can see just here where it says LA. And you'll see we have the Malibu coast area here, the south coast, including the likes of Cucamonga Valley just to the north and Temecula Valley. So this is the real southern section of California. And because the movement of these religious people starts to move up from the south, this is the first burgeoning area in terms of wine production. So it all begins in the southern section. It all begins around Los Angeles. Of course, we know it very differently today, but this is the beginnings, the stepping stones into viticulture for the region. Oh, let's move on to the next bit. Here we go. Now, the grapes that were initially brought over, remember, had really one major aim, and that's they're going to make wine for sacramental purposes, for altar wine. So the grapes are brought across. They're brought across from Europe via places like the Canary Islands. And the etymology, the name of these grapes tend to change as they move through distance and time as they head towards the New World. So we have a grape variety called Listan Prieto, which exits Spain, comes into the Canary Islands, which is a really important refueling station for these ships as they head out to the New World. And then this grape heads across. Now, because it's used by missionaries for liturgical purposes, it starts to get really the moniker of the mission grape, but it is Listan Prieto, also known as Palomino Negro. So this is the first non-native grape variety made into wine. And we still do find this today. It doesn't make wine like we expect today, so there's little amounts of it left, but you will find Mission grape in places like Southern California and places like Lodi, for example, still making light wines with very delicate compounds behind them. But you can find them. Then we have a shift of focus for California. So we know that initially wine production was centered around Southern California, the South Coast. But vinifera grapes are then focused towards the north. Why? Well, in 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in the Sierra foothills. So with this gold being found comes a gold rush, and hundreds of thousands of people come from parts of Americas, but also, of course, mainly from other parts of the world to seek their fortune, of course. San Francisco, which was an emerging establishment at that time, increases its population to 25,000 in 1 year alone. And with that increase of populace comes different types of peoples, and that different types of peoples with skill sets. So we have grape growers, winemakers, a lot of them from the Midwest, the East Coast, and from Europe. So we have really this catalyst for change around the Sierra foothills. So we can map this out. Here is in fact part of the Sierra foothills. You'll notice places like Yuba County, Nevada County. We've got El Dorado, very famous, of course, for those the gold rush times. And down here we have towards Sacramento, and then we have San Francisco being off towards the west. Remember, before the map was way off in the south, south of Los Angeles, but now we're way into the north, to the north of San Francisco, to the northeast. So this is what I like to call mapping the gold rush, just so you can see the movement north in California in terms and the shift in focus due to the gold rush. Now we have a few important figures that we must talk about. We have someone who is called Count Agoston Haraszthy. So it's the gentleman in this picture. He was a Hungarian-American polymath, a multi-skilled person, a nobleman, an adventurer, a traveler, writer, town builder, and pioneer winemaker. He was also rather flamboyant and quite outspoken as well. He arrives in San Diego in 1849, and his businesses that he sets up begin to plant vineyards, fruit orchards. He has a livery stable, stagecoach line, a butcher shop, and also organizes real estate. Now, I'm not saying I'm anything like this gentleman, but there's a similar sort of inkling in terms of the ambition here, because I have 5 businesses. He had more than that. So I kind of understand his kind of drive towards having all of these businesses. Now, the next year, in 1850, he is elected the sheriff of San Diego County. I mean, as if he hasn't got too much on his plate already. And then in 1851, the year after that, he's elected to the California State Assembly. In 1856, he purchases a small vineyard northeast of Sonoma, and he renames it Buena Vista, which is a vineyard which still has operation today with a lot of fame behind it. In 1859, 3 years after that, he writes a report on grapes and wine of California, which is published by Californian State Agricultural Society, and it is considered the first important work on the Californian wine industry. In 1861, just 2 years after that, he's appointed as a commissioner to report to state legislature on ways and means to best adapt and promote the improvement and growth of grapevine production in California. In order to create this report, he travels And in 1861, that same year, he visits major wine regions in France, Germany, Switzerland, Hungary, of course, and Spain. And he returns with over 100,000 vine cuttings of more than 350 vine varieties. Off the back of that, he establishes a commercial nursery, and he is accredited really for introducing a lot of the Vitis vinifera into California. However, the issue is that his trip gallivanting across Europe, actually, he kind of spent a lot of money, and he came back and tried to get his expenses reimbursed, and it did not work. So he actually became severely in debt at that time, and his burgeoning empire really for wine nurseries kind of started to fall apart. By 1868, he leaves California for Nicaragua, and by 1869, he actually does pass away in kind of auspicious circumstances. In Nicaragua, he said that he fell from a tree into a lake full of crocodiles, alligators, and met an untimely end. He was, of course, quite severely in debt by that time. So after that moment, we start to see in 1869 more expansion due to the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And this, of course, connects the infrastructure of California to other parts of the United States. Californian wine begins to be popular in East Coast cities. California wine wins awards and trophies at international competitions. And there are an increase at that point of Californian wine exports. So it's going rather well. And at the end of the 19th century, we see a really, really burgeoning wine industry from the Golden State. However, this is going to really be halted almost exactly in its tracks. And that is because of a moment in time which here in California spans around 14 years. And this is prohibition. Now, in the middle of the 19th century, the temperance movement starts to really take motion. And this is really led by a group of women based across the United States who are really concerned about the behavior of a lot of the men out here in the United States that are becoming drunk and leading to domestic violence and things like that. And rightly so, the concerns were there. But this led to a much stronger and powerful movement in order to try and ban the sale of alcohol and the production of alcohol. And this gained huge momentum by the start of the 20th century. So in 1909, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution written into law is on the first federal income tax. And instantly, the alcohol tax stopped being an important source of revenue for the federal government, which means the only really saving grace they had against the temperance movement at the time was that it was producing revenue for the federal government. That stopped. So they had very little legs to stand on after that point. And by 1919, and it is earlier in other states, but here in California, the Volstead Act passes, the 18th Amendment. The production, sale, and transportation of all alcoholic beverages becomes illegal. Home winemaking is still permitted in small quantities. I won't go into too much details, but there is a little bit of home winemaking. But of course, this becomes rather basic and from very low quality. Now, we have really a very sort of dark ages for wine production. 14 years of a ban of production, with a very few wineries surviving during that time because of loopholes around this prohibition, producing grapes which will be made into wine for medicinal or sacramental purposes, or the sales of yeast and dried must home kits for home winemaking. This kept a few places alive, but of course it was a minor market, and of course competition was quite intense. Fewer than 100 wineries remained at the end of 1933, down from 2,500 in 1919. And also, there is the psychology of winemaking and wine consumption at this time. So really kind of poor quality home wine was made. And American wine tastes changed during that time towards more sweet fortified wines being more easier to control and to stabilize with the addition of spirit. So, of course, really people out of the 1930s were used to drinking kind of sweet fortified wines, whereas before 1919, they were drinking dry table wine. But of course, that does end in 1933. And we start to see an emergence of Californian wine again. And this is our second key industry figure, Andrei Telechtchev, which you'll see in this picture. Russian winemaker trained in France. And in 1938, he is hired as a winemaker by Georges de la Tour, who is the owner of Beaulieu Vineyard in Napa Valley, very famously with BV on the label. Now, Telechtchev introduces the Georges de la Tour Private Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon, which really is a seminal moment in Californian wine production because it is this idea of a prestige wine in a winery's portfolio. He introduces new techniques, things like elevated hygiene in the winery environment, temperature controlled fermentation, controlled malolactic conversion, and really he schools or influences a lot of winemakers, including the likes of Robert Mondavi, Louis Martini, Joe Heitz, Mike Grigich, and many, many others. So really these become absolute giants, of course, in the wine industry, and we could say that this is the kind of butterfly effect that Andrei has on the wine industry. One of those is, of course, the next chap here, who's a rather young picture of him, but this is Bob Mondavi, Robert Mondavi. In 1943, his family, the Mondavi family, purchases Charles Krug Winery. After attending Stanford, Robert returns home to work, hopefully in harmony with his brother Peter, with Robert being in sales and Peter in winemaking. Robert, by the 1950s, becomes absolutely convinced that the US will have a fine wine culture, and probably in Napa Valley. It will be a wine, worldwide wine destination that people will come from miles around to visit. Now, I said hopefully there will be an amicable relationship between brothers. It breaks down in 1965, and Bob Mondavi leaves Charles Krug, and the year after, 1966, he opens his own winery named after himself, and that's in Oakville. It's the Valley's first new winery since the 1930s, late 30s. Lovely winery design, focus on single varietal wines. In 1968, the first oak-aged Fumé Blanc is released, Sauvignon Blanc, of course, and the reserve wines are produced from the historic Toquelon vineyard. It becomes, of course, a real key visitor area. And he always, until his death, I think it was in early 90s, his age, he was a tireless promoter of the quality wines of Napa. Then we have a moment in time, another seminal moment in May the 24th, 1976. There is a tasting called the Judgement of Paris. Englishman Stephen Spurrier, who was a wine merchant who was established in Paris, he sets up a tasting in Paris to celebrate the 200th birthday of the United States of America, and it is coined the Judgement of Paris. From his trip to the United States, he selects his favorite wines to compete against the greatest of both Burgundy and Bordeaux. The mainly selection of French judges chose the 1973 Chateau Montelena Chardonnay and the 1973 Stag's Leap Wine Cellars SLV Cabernet Sauvignon over the French counterparts. This became, of course, an international press sensation. Now, there are lots of discussion points around this. The French weren't too happy, but it was rated by the French. Of course, there were excuses like, well, the vintages of Bordeaux were weaker, not specifically the greatest vintages to compete. The wines of America won't age as well as the Bordelais will. And of course, that was put to sleep, really, by doing the same tasting again 10 years later, which California won in even greater amounts. Post this tasting, there was a huge, almost like a gold rush, but a land rush in terms of finding land, planting vineyards and opening wineries in California. And by 1980, the number of wineries finally returns to the levels of the late 19th century, which was the real first big boom in California. And we come into the modern age. So now we're talking about sort of the last 40 years or so. Most vineyards were planted mainly using a rootstock called the new AXR1 rootstock, which could give vines with higher yields than the traditional rootstocks. The issue being that AXR1 had some Vitis vinifera ancestry in its DNA, and it actually proved quite unsuitable when phylloxera started to attack Californian vineyards in 1986 for the second time. In less than a decade, phylloxera devastates entire regions from southern California, the original birthplace of viticulture, to the north coast, and many small vineyard owners and wineries were forced to fold due to those pressures. Large-scale replanting was required, and this came really as a silver lining. Every cloud has a silver lining, so it was difficult to begin with, but they were able to replant, really start afresh, really planting the correct grape varieties in the correct land with modern thinking. And that's really what gave California a big step up in terms of the modern market. Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, and Merlot start to really dominate plantations at this time. 1999, Cabernet Sauvignon surpasses Chardonnay as the most widely planted grape in the state. And the 1990s saw the rise in deeply colored, highly concentrated, high alcohol red wines in response to both consumer demand and critical press acclaim. Whites also tended to be made in a very ripe style with lots of new oak. But this trend is actually more past now. We are coming around to much more balance and elegance in the wine styles. And the quality of wine in California certainly has been higher than ever before, with some really beautiful wines to be found. There is much more greater concentration on matching grape variety to the microclimate and the site in terms of things like soil, geology matching. And also, of course, a very high amount of professionally trained winemakers that have experience both in the state but further afield around the world. And of course, you've got the really important, highly regarded local wine research center, which is in Davis, UC Davis, which gives you a huge wealth of experimentation, but also, of course, of knowledge behind it as well. To give you an idea about the success of Cabernet Sauvignon, in Napa, the price of a ton of Cabernet Sauvignon has doubled in 2 decades. So if you go back to 2000, it was about $3,200 a ton, and now it's about $8,000 a ton. That's a scary increase, and that's why real estate in California is rather expensive. Okay, so a long video, but I do hope you've enjoyed this introduction to California. Please do join me for part 2, looking at climatic factors, topography, and of course, soils. This part is only going to be available on my e-learning portal. You'll see the details of that at the bottom of your slide, winewithjimmy.com. Please do go over and visit that. So thank you very much for watching. And if you do find yourself in the UK, come and say hi for a glass or bottle. I've been Jimmy Smith. Ciao for now. Goodbye.